So, the sympathetic nervous system. In the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic motor neuron cell bodies are in the spinal cord from T1 to L2. Therefore, the sympathetic nervous system is sometimes called the thoracolumbar division because it's going, from T1 all the way through T2, and then a little bit of the lumbar segments of the spinal cord, L1 and L2. The sympathetic nervous system has preganglionic axons that are short and myelinated, and postganglionic axons that are long and unmyelinated. The sympathetic nervous system ganglionic neurons are found in 3 locations. That's a bit of a simplification, but it's good for a start. And the locations are in the sympathetic chain ganglia, in the collateral ganglia, or in the adrenal medulla. The sympathetic chain ganglia are found close to the vertebral column. They're connected to the spinal nerves by gray and white rami. The ganglia are also connected to each other in a chain called the sympathetic chain ganglia. The connections between the ganglia carry the axons of the preganglionic neurons that are traveling to superior and inferior ganglia. Because of this, the sympathetic chain ganglia can extend above and below the T1 to L2 spinal cord segments and actually extend to cervical regions and coccygeal regions around the spinal cord. Not in the spinal cord, but around the spinal cord, close to the spinal cord. There are a variable number of ganglia in the sympathetic chain ganglia. There are 3 cervical ganglia, 11 to 12 thoracic ganglia, 2 to 5 lumbar ganglia, and 4 to 5 sacral ganglia. There is just 1 coccygeal ganglion. Okay, so let's talk about sympathetic chain ganglia pathways. So the sympathetic chain ganglia. The axons of the preganglionic neurons exit the spinal cord by the ventral roots of the T1 to L2 spinal nerves. The axons immediately leave the spinal nerve and pass through a white ramus to a nearby sympathetic chain ganglia. White rami are only found from T1 to L2. The preganglionic axon synapses with the cell body of the ganglionic neuron in the sympathetic chain ganglion. The postganglionic axon leaves the ganglion by the gray ramus. It's now unmyelinated, so the ramus is gray, and re-enters the spinal nerve. It then travels to its effector organ. Some preganglionic axons enter the sympathetic chain ganglion and either ascend or descend before synapsing with a ganglionic neuron at a higher or lower level. The postganglionic axons pass through the gray ramus, re-enter the spinal cord, and travel to their effector organs from that higher or lower level of the spinal cord. Therefore, gray rami are found at all segments of the spinal cord because they may ascend quite a bit up into the neck or descend quite a bit all the way to the coccyx. And then once the postganglionic axons have reached their destination, they need to get out. So they need gray rami at whatever level they have reached to be present so that they can escape from the sympathetic chain ganglion and join a spinal nerve again. The sympathetic chain ganglia innervate the skin, including blood vessels, sweat glands, erector pili muscles, and adipose connective tissue. The superior cervical ganglion innervates the intraocular dilator pupillae muscle and mucus and salivary glands. And if you look over here at the picture, they're showing you an eye to remind you that there's an interocular dilator pupillae muscle that is innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. And then there are salivary glands in this picture. And there are also mucus glands that are all innervated by the sympathetic chain ganglia. Collateral ganglia. So remember, some ganglionic neurons are found in three collateral or prevertebral ganglia rather than being in the sympathetic chain ganglia. So let's learn about those. So some preganglionic axons from the inferior thoracic and superior lumbar spinal cord enter the sympathetic chain ganglion through white rami, but they do not synapse with a ganglionic neuron. Instead, the preganglionic axons leave the sympathetic chain ganglion, they haven't synapsed with anything, and form four splanchnic nerves or abdominopelvic organ nerves, but called splank. The splanchnic nerves travel to the three collateral or prevertebral ganglia. The three collateral ganglia are anterior to the vertebral column and abdominal aorta. And this is a pretty good picture showing the celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglion, and the inferior mesenteric ganglion. The preganglionic axons synapse with the ganglionic neurons in the collateral ganglia. The postganglionic axons innervate the abdominal and pelvic organs, including the liver, stomach, spleen, pancreas, small and large intestines, kidneys, bladder, uterus, ovaries, penis, and scrotum. Okay, next, the adrenal medulla. So, some sympathetic nervous system ganglionic neurons are found in the adrenal medulla. Some preganglionic axons from the inferior thoracic spinal cord enter the sympathetic chain ganglia through a white ramus, but do not synapse with a ganglionic neuron. Instead, the axons leave the ganglion and travel all the way to the adrenal medulla or the inner part of the adrenal gland. These cells in the adrenal medulla are modified ganglionic neurons. These neurons secrete the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream when stimulated by preganglionic axon. Epinephrine and norepinephrine enter the blood and carry sympathetic nervous system stimulation to target tissues all over the body. Note, there is no parasympathetic input into the adrenal medulla. So, to summarize, we have our preganglionic neurons with their cell bodies in the lateral horns of the spinal segments, T1 to L2. Then we have our ganglionic neurons in one of three places, the sympathetic chain ganglia, the collateral ganglia, or the adrenal medulla. And then from the sympathetic chain ganglia and collateral ganglia, the commands go to the visceral effectors. The adrenal medulla, on the other hand, by releasing hormones into the bloodstream, goes to organs and systems throughout the body. Any organ tissue system that has receptor for norepinephrine or epinephrine will be stimulated by them. Okay, and here's a summary slide from Martini's that you can read through. All right, sympathetic nervous system functions. The sympathetic nervous system usually causes excitation of the target tissue. The sympathetic nervous system increases alertness and stimulates metabolism. It's active during exertion and sexual climax. Sympathetic postganglionic axons can innervate specific target tissues. For example, smooth muscle in the blood vessels in the skin may constrict to prevent heat loss in the cold. That's possible. However, in an emergency, the hypothalamus commands the entire sympathetic nervous system to respond. Target tissues all over the body are stimulated by specific neurons. In addition, the adrenal medulla is stimulated to release norepinephrine and epinephrine into the blood, and the blood carries these hormones to target tissues all over the body. The end result is that a fight or flight reaction is induced, and this is called sympathetic activation. There are many effects of sympathetic activation. One, increased alertness. Two, increased heart rate, cardiac muscle contraction strength, blood pressure, blood flow, and O2 to muscles, and respiratory rate. Increased muscle tone, possibly with trembling and shivering. Increased glycogen breakdown in muscles and the liver, and lipid release from adipose connective tissue. Sympathetic activation also causes increased energy and euphoria, often with disregard for danger and insensitivity to pain. So sometimes they'll say somebody's an adrenal junkie. The old name for epinephrine was adrenaline. So adrenaline junkie, they'll say. And possibly one of the reasons that they like to do something that's a little bit scary, such people, is because the sympathetic activation does cause things that might be experienced as favorable, like increased alertness, increased energy and euphoria, disregard for danger, and insensitivity to pain. That all sounds pretty good. The release of epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood is part of our helpful short-term stress response. It only lasts for a few minutes. The release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, and glucocorticoids into the blood is part of our unhelpful long-term stress response. And here we have a summary slide about the sympathetic nervous system, describing many qualities of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, now on to the parasympathetic nervous system.